Hello, everybody. This is Tim Green with Rattle Magazine. What follows is our conversation with Ruth Reichl, which appeared in issue number 88 of the magazine. It was recorded on March 25th, 2025. As a former culinary student and foodie herself, our associate editor, Katie Dozier, joined in on the discussion. Ruth Reichl is recognized as one of the most discerning voices in the food world, with accolades as a best-selling author, revered restaurant critic, and culinary industry influencer. Her icon status stems from groundbreaking roles in food journalism, including lead restaurant critic at the New York Times and editor-in-chief at Gourmet Magazine. Ruth's best-selling memoirs include Save Me the Plums, my gourmet memoir, which chronicles her tenure at the magazine, and Tender at the Bone, growing up at the table. Her cookbook, My Kitchen Year, 136 recipes that saved my life, received best cookbook accolades from industry peers and booksellers. For TV, Ruth's PBS series, Gourmet's Adventures with Ruth, featured the best cooking schools around the world. What does food have to do with poetry? Listen in and find out. We'll be back next week with our regular episode of the Rattlecast. Yeah, well, Katie introduced me to your work, and she said when we were doing a food poems issue, she said we have to try to get to talk to Ruth Reichl, and then so I started reading some of your reviews and some of your memoir and some of your novel, and your writing is so informed by poetry, I would say, and I was really excited to see, your memoir the title is a reference to William Carlos Williams. And you have characters as poets in your novel, the Paris novel, and so I'm really interested in hearing how much poetry has informed the way you approach writing, because it seems sort of apparent as a poetry editor reading your writing that you read poetry and love language in the same way.
I am not conscious of really being someone who reads a lot of poetry, although I do have a book of, C.K. Williams poems sitting by my bed. It was only after we spoke or communicated that I, went back and realized, oh my God, I mean, it's not just Save Me the Plums. I mean, Garlic and Sapphires is another. Um, I mean, if you want to think of the Song of Songs as poetry, I mean, I I tend to go to the poets for my titles. And um, I realize that, although I mean, I genuinely don't think, I mean, you wouldn't look at my bookshelves and say, "Oh my God, they're filled with books about poetry or books of poetry." But it's really true that I think of words in that way, and I think it has a lot to do. My dad was a book designer, and words have always mattered enormously to me. And um, you know, I when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, so I grew up in Greenwich Village, and I went to PS 41, and every day as I was walking to school, I passed Patchen Place where E. E. Cummings lived. So, you know, because, my dad would say as he was walking, E. E. Cummings lives right down there, and maybe one day we'll see him. So, probably my first real connection with poetry was Cummings, which, I
Hmm.
mean, nobody has ever been more appealing to children, I think, than Cummings.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
Uh,
he's one of our favorite poets at Rattle too, and
Mm-hmm.
one of the often, and anyone who lived in a pretty how town is one of those poems we quote so much, talking about the children's poetry that we do. And down they forgot as up they grew, and there's so many wonderful lines, and,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah. So I'm curious about how you approach food writing, because there are going to be 25 poets in this issue writing about food in some way, inspired by
I'm
food.
amazed that you found 25 poets.
Oh,
Uh,
well, we had about, I don't know, 4,000 submissions or
Mm-hmm.
something to choose from. So,
Mm-hmm.
really?
it was really a tough issue to get into, actually, because
Yeah.
food is such an important part of our lives. And so it's something, most poets have some food poems,
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But then all those tools of craft and making words turning words into life like that. it's hard to do with food because it's something that we're so familiar with. There's so many sort of cliches and adjectives to use, and to bring the food to life in the ways that you do is really fascinating. So I'm really curious to hear about how you approach writing about food in that way. How do you make it so visceral?
Well, so here's the thing about food. One is we don't have a lot of words for taste in the English language. I mean, they're just, if you go into the thesaurus, um, which, early in my career, I was endlessly in the thesaurus looking for, words for flavor, and there just aren't very many. And then you think about, of all the senses, this is the only one where we have literally no idea whether you taste the same thing that I taste. I mean, there is no way of measuring that at all. So it's a very private thing. And so I realized really early on that I had to go beyond flavor. And that what I was trying to evoke was trying to make people understand what I was tasting, not knowing if they would taste the same thing when they bit into that apple or, you know, twirled that spaghetti around their fork, if they would taste the same thing. But I wanted to give them the sense of what I was feeling. And I realized you can't just go sweet, bitter, salt. And so I started going out into the sensory world in other ways. And, suddenly you're evoking weather and temperature. And um, and it's it's not very long until you are, I think, thinking like a poet, where you're trying to grab these really ephemeral things out of the air and put them on the page. And, when I haven't taught writing a lot, but when I do, I always start with a sprig of parsley and say to the students, okay, you have 15 minutes and you have to describe the taste of parsley to someone who has never had it before. And it's the fastest way to make them understand that they're going to go beyond flavor. I mean, they're going to go into texture, they're going to go into color, they're they're going to like find themselves in a field somewhere. And so that's sort of where I started. And I guess, I mean, the other thing is when I wrote my first cookbook when I was 21, and I had no money. I was living on the Lower East Side of New York, and I was swimming in the joy of going in and out of all these grocery stores and trying to convey that on the page. And I had so much fun doing that that a couple of years later, when I was asked if I wanted to write restaurant reviews, all I could think of was the ones that are in the world right now are so boring. I mean, who cares? They're consumer reviews. They're how to spend your money. It's like pick this dish, not that dish, or giving the chef advice on what he's doing wrong, when none of them were about the joy of going to a restaurant and discovering these flavors and all the other things that could happen in a restaurant. You could be someone else. You could, imagine a new life for yourself. And I just thought, whatever I'm going to do, it is not going to be saying to someone, spend your money here, not there. And then I sort of got into the whole idea of like, what is criticism? And, I mean, the boring kind of criticism is consumer reporting. The great kind of criticism is you give people tools to appreciate the experience. It doesn't matter whether it's literature or theater or art or food. It's people come away with a better way to go out and have that experience. And again, you get into how do you evoke you know, the thrill of what's going to happen to them. How do you make them come back with something that's bigger than they would have if they hadn't read your work?
Yeah, I read too, with thinking about how you approach restaurant reviews, is that you'd like to figure out what the restaurant is trying to do and then analyze like how they're doing it and how well they're doing it versus looking at it like how you think they should be doing it. I was interested if you could talk more about that.
Well, um, but I mean, again, that is, I think, true of all criticism too. I mean, any critic can say, I know what I like, and this isn't it. But if you're going to do serious criticism, you have to first try and understand what the person who's creating that work of art or that meal or whatever it is, what are they trying to do, and are they successful in that or not? And then, if you're the person who is reading that to get some knowledge, you can decide, well, I'm really not interested in what that person is trying to do, and maybe I shouldn't bother with this. Rather than, I mean, I think it's the laziest kind of criticism, but it is what you find so often. And I see it. I think I experienced it most strongly. My my first novel, the New York Times gave it the nastiest review you have ever read of anything. I mean, it's really horrible. And I realized that the reviewer was basically saying, why is this smart woman, why has she disappointed me by writing a feel-good book? Rather than saying, this is a feel-good book and it's not to my taste, which is fine, but you can't review anything by what you wish the person had created.
Yeah. I'm very curious to hear you talk about too just why criticism is important in general. I hate this idea that criticism is bad. Personally, it's something we deal with in poetry where there's a struggle because, putting yourself out there in a poem is doing something, but at the same time, we need to be able to have this sort of art criticism level of discussion in poetry. So I'm curious why you think just intelligent, thoughtful criticism is important in general.
Um, because I think that we all need tools to better make our way through the world. And it doesn't matter what it is that's being criticized. We need other people's opinions, basically. We need people who are smarter than we are on a certain subject to help us. I mean, it's sort of like, when I was learning how to be a boss, when I went to Gourmet, I mean, the first thing I learned is that I had to hire people who were smarter than me, that I didn't know. I didn't know how to be an art director. So I had to, hire an art director who I would trust, and that I would trust that even if I didn't like what they were doing, maybe it was the right thing to do. And, I think in life, we all need to acknowledge that other people's opinions are valuable to us, and that when you come upon an experience, a book, a poem, a meal, sometimes it is really useful to have people who spend their lives thinking about those things help you find your way through it. I mean, when I was in art history, one of the things one of my professors said that, made so much sense to me was you can't expect someone who just goes to a museum and is looking at a painting to understand it the way somebody who studied it for 20 years can understand it. And it is really helpful to have that perspective. Your life is enriched by it. And unfortunately, that means, sometimes you like something and someone who's smarter than you says, it's really not very good.
Yeah, I mean, that's really one of the main things I wanted to talk about, because poetry right now, as a community and an institution, like, needs you. That's what I was thinking reading your work, because there's such a deficit in like thoughtful, honest criticism within the entire literary world, I'd say. There's the higher echelon where, you could be a New York Times bestseller and then there are real reviews in the New York Times. But on the small level, when poetry entered academia, it became this sort of club. And everybody's afraid to review everybody else in an honest way, because they might be on the prize committee next year. And so there's this whole, over decades, it's sort of been established that all we do are sort of write, as you said, like consumer reviews, but without wanting to offend anybody.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like we're writing book blurbs, pretending they're reviews for our friends. And so at Rattle, we had reviews I was trying to publish for, 10 years. Finally, I just threw my hands up, because everybody, it turned out, was friends with everybody. They were trading reviews as favors, and there was just no actual critical analysis anywhere. There are a few people who write actual critical reviews these days, and they're all like the most hated person in poetry is how they're referred to. And so, but we need that so badly. So I'd love to talk more about how you get past that. I mean, if you go to a restaurant and you're writing a review, it's the same way. Like the food world is like a small world, the great
Tiny
chefs
world.
in New York all know you're going to run into them again. And yet you're doing this review, which you have to stay authentic and honest about, knowing that you're going to see them next month. How do you get past that?
Well, let me say that in the course of my career, which has been very long, I mean, I've been at this for more than 50 years. When I started, it was a very different food world. And it was kind of like we were all in it together, the chefs, the critics. I mean, nobody in America cared about food. And there was this tiny handful of us jumping up and down saying, this is important, pay attention to this. I mean, food defines a community and a country, and the fact that we are blind to it is a problem. And so it was not an adversarial relationship at all. By the time I came to New York in 1993 to be at the New York Times, everything had changed. And I was very fortunate, because at that point I had lived in California for 20 years and I didn't know any chefs in New York. I didn't get to know any. And one of the reasons that I was happy to leave being a critic at that point was that I missed chefs a lot. But my 6 years at the New York Times, I spent zero time in the food community. And so it was very easy for me to be completely honest. And it felt important, because I felt as if at that point, the chefs and the critics in New York had been so cozy that the public didn't trust them anymore. And so, I went through this whole very elaborate, the costumes and the characters that I created. But it was all about saying to the public, I'm one of you, I'm on your side. I am not part of this community. And I really wasn't. And it is really hard, because, as you say, the food world is tiny. And now, I just came from an event in California, which I call sleepaway camp for food folk. But I mean, where you suddenly just realize, oh my God, we all really do know each other. It's so tiny, and I'm sure the poetry world is exactly the same. Except that we have probably a larger public now. We didn't 50 years
that's
ago.
the thing that's so exciting about it, because we're doing the same thing. We're shouting around saying, this is the fundamental basic human art. Before we had anything else, we had the oral tradition of storytelling this way. And especially in the age of AI, like having an outlet for creativity like that in your own self-expression that really mines your psyche is just so valuable. And in the same way that food is, was overlooked as something that's really culturally and spiritually valuable, I think poetry is in the same kind of boat right now. And so our mission has always been to try to find a way to elevate it, and make it so that people can appreciate the enriching qualities that you get when you participate with poetry. And so it's really interesting to hear and think about you as a role model for elevating the way we think and the way we engage with it, because it's just so valuable. I think both of them are.
Yeah, I think engaging is a really important distinction too, because what I love so much about your writing, Ruth, is how the reader is always right there with you. You know, whether it's a restaurant review or even a cookbook, you know, my year of cooking, we are right there with you, and you draw us into your experience and let us in. And that's something I think that contemporary poetry needs to do a better job of too.
Yeah, I think we do not have the onus that poetry has, which, um, I mean, it's the thing that William Carlos Williams was so against. I mean, I love his work. I mean, here's a doctor who, you know, is also a poet, but who very much wanted to yank poetry into the world, right? And to because so much of the great poetry right around his time is so intellectual, you feel like you need a PhD to be able to understand, what Yeats is saying. Um, and, I mean, it's kind of what Ulysses did to literature, right? I mean, you need to study it rather than just read it. And food writing didn't really ever have that. Nobody ever thought you had to go to school to read about food.
Yeah. So how do you, going back to writing and the process of writing, how do you sit down when you're going to be writing a review or for your memoir or your novel now? How do you approach the writing process? I always wonder with poets or with other people who aren't writing poetry, because we've talked to poets so much, how similar it is to the process of writing a poem, and how you go about crafting. One of the main things I want to ask about was voice, because one of the things that's really clear is that when you read one of your articles, you hear a Ruth Reichl, and you know sort of who you're talking to. And poets always talk about finding a voice, and nobody really knows what that means, but like, how do you find your voice as a poet? And really what it means is to be authentic, I guess. But did you have any difficulty getting to that authentic place within your writing?
Well, so let me tell you that I had no idea that I had a voice. And when I was on book tour for my kitchen year, Nancy Leeson, who is she's a restaurant critic in Seattle, got on stage with me, and she read something from my kitchen year, and then she handed me my first cookbook, which I wrote when I was 21, and had me read a passage from it. And I was gobsmacked, honestly. It was the same voice. And I couldn't deny it, that I had been essentially, 55 years later, there I was, like, it was clearly the same person. No one would ever have denied that. And it was like, oh my God, I guess I've just been, and you think, because, as you know, writing is rewriting, and you rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and you go over everything. And you have no idea that what's coming out is something that is really how you talk and think. Um, and what I always say about that is, I feel like I learned to write at the table, because when I was growing up, it was, I was an only child of older parents who were both very literary. And dinner was a place where you had to have a story. You had to come to the table with a story of something that had happened to you that day. And I learned two things. One is everybody's life is interesting. Interesting things, dozens of interesting things worth talking about happen to all of us every day. And two, I learned how to tell a story. I learned where the lead was, right? I would sit at the table thinking, what's how do I begin this story? And of course, beginning this story is half of it, more than half of it. And so I really do feel like when I called my first book Growing Up at the Table, I did grow up at the table. Um, but the other thing, I was at the a writer's workshop in Mexico a few weeks ago, and the first speaker was John Irving. And he said, I always write my last chapter first, so I know exactly where I'm going. And, I realized that I'm the opposite. I write novels to find out what's going to happen. I have no idea what's going to happen. And that for me is the joy of it, right? I mean, it's like you invent these characters and then you kind of let them loose and see what happens to them. And if you're very lucky, they turn out, I am so in love with the characters in my Paris novel that I'm writing a sequel to it because I just couldn't bear not to be with them anymore. And I wanted to know what happened to them. And I still don't, I'm in the book and I'm finding out what happened to them.
I think your sense of discovery is definitely contagious. And, we often say with poets, if you know what you're going to write about, then you shouldn't write the poem. And it's very evident, like your discovery through, all the different types of writing that you do. And I was curious specifically about what's probably your most famous review, your review of Le Cirque in 1993, which is like very soon after you got to New York, you came out with this incredible review. And I was curious because, ultimately, I think it's fair to say it becomes a review that's all about the haves and the have-nots, how you go through your experience as an unknown diner. And then once you're recognized as your experience and how different it is. So did you know that was the scaffolding that you were going to explore in the review when you sat down to write, or did that just come out as it was?
No, I pretty much knew that because I was the restaurant critic of the LA Times for 11 years. And I would come to New York and my mother would say, won't you take me to Le Cirque? I mean, she loved fancy restaurants. And, I finally, I could take her out to great restaurants. And she would always say, I'd love to go to Le Cirque. And my response always was, Mom, you don't want to go with me. I'm not known there. And it won't be fun. So, and, it was kind of, it was the dirty little secret of New York that restaurant really was like a private club. And that if you weren't in the club, if you weren't one of the ladies who lunched, if you weren't, one of those names that shows up in the paper all the time, that you weren't going to get treated very well. And, it's interesting because I knew that my bosses were terrified of that review. I didn't know why until the next day when they told me that it was the publisher's favorite restaurant. And they, Punch Salzburger loved that restaurant and they were terrified that he was going to be furious about it. But his first call that morning was from Walter Annenberg, who said that's the best review the New York Times has ever published because he had once gone there and not been recognized and been treated like dirt and had never gone again. But, it was, so I had a pretty good sense that would happen. Not quite as spectacularly as it happened. I mean, I did not expect to be treated either as badly as I was treated the many times I went in disguise, or to have them, really dance around when I finally showed up undisguised and, and give me that famous line, which will probably be, on my tombstone, the King of Spain is waiting in the bar where your table is ready. I mean, I just lucked out on that one.
Well, I think there's such a great lesson there in just having the trust of the reader. That is a seminal moment where you're on the side of the people who are actually reading, and as opposed to the community, and on the side of honesty and authenticity. And I think that just goes such a long way, right? Into creating that rapport where you can just continue to be honest too.
And one of the really great things that happened from that review is because no restaurant from that point forward knew who the critic was going to be. Suddenly they had to be nice to everyone because they really did not want to they didn't want that to happen to them. Nobody wanted, you know, to be Sirio Macchione after that review.
Hmm.
And even Sirio, in fact, I mean, he, according to his biographer, was so appalled by this picture of himself that he changed.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's just, for me too, any kind of criticism, there's the superficial, oh, that can be mean. And then there's the deep change you can inspire by saying, hey, this needs to change. And that's, what I want for poetry too.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I'm curious. If the how much the landscape of criticism has changed because of the internet and reviews. I mean, hearing you talk about how much people cared about the critic being there and how how careful they were to please them and ignore everybody else in a world today where the Yelp reviews over everything or just general reviews online all over the place. You can't do that. It sort of democratizes that away, that sort of special treatment, I'd say. So has that changed the landscape of food reviewing in a really significant way? It seems like it must have.
I think it really has. And it's also, I mean, things are so different now. I mean, when I first started reviewing, the people who went out to eat were rich white people, rich older white people. That is not the case anymore. I mean, the audience for restaurants, even expensive restaurants today, is young, I mean, younger, much more casual. It's your grandparents aren't the people who really matter in restaurants anymore. It's that scruffy tech guy and his wife who both come in blue jeans and then drop $3,000 on a bottle of wine. I mean, it's a completely different landscape of diners
Hmm.
and of critics. I mean, one of the other things that is amazing today, and I'm sure the same is true in poetry, but the people who write the reviews are very different. I mean,
Hmm.
um, fascinatingly, um, I had to give a talk at a temple recently, and they wanted me to talk about how being Jewish had impacted my career. And I had to say, look, I've never been religious. I didn't grow up in a religious household. It hasn't impacted me in any way. And then and then my agent said, you got to come up with something, Ruth. You can't go, they really want something. And so I started thinking, and I realized that at the point where I became the restaurant critic of the Los Angeles Times, every major critic in America was Jewish. Every major food critic.
Hmm.
It didn't matter what city you went to. It was, and in New York, you had Gail Greens, Seymour Britchke, Jeffrey Steingarten. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And then I started looking at the history of food. So, like, who's probably the most important, in a funny way, food critic? Claude Levi-Strauss. Then you look at American food writers, at uh, uh, J.K. Liebling, a Jew, um, Bud Trillin, Jewish, Joseph Exberg. I mean, probably the three major New Yorker writers, food writers, all Jewish. And I realized that part of it is that women and minority groups tend to find places that aren't already occupied to find a niche for themselves. And, there were no food writing wasn't a big thing. So there was a place for us. And, Mimi Sheridan and me and Phyllis Richmond, we all sort of found our way in there. And that's no longer the case. I mean, the moment of the Jewish food writer is no longer with us. And now it's the moment of the queer, people of color, Asian. I mean, the food writing community is much, much larger
Hmm.
than it was when I started.
Hmm.
which is great because you have these whole new voices which are coming in, and it makes it very exciting.
Hmm.
Hmm.
What would you say that you mentioned that the sea change in the restaurant goer, from older, wealthy people to just a much more diverse, in every category, type of clientele. What do you think caused that? Like, what made fine dining kind of explode?
Um, well, food has become part of popular culture, which it just wasn't. And I would say that probably the big moment is food television.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean, we have a generation. I mean, there are a few things. One is food television, which made chefs cool, and suddenly, restaurants, kids grew up watching chefs cooking on TV. But the other thing is that um, you're too young to remember this, but um, air travel was for very wealthy people, air travel and steamer travel. And the price of air travel came down in the 60s, which is right when you see the real changes. The early 70s is when the changes in food happened because, people like me went to Europe on $2 a day and backpacked around, and we're suddenly eating in, Italy and Greece and France, and, came home with very changed tastes.
Hmm.
And today, the fact that people travel all over the world, it makes food and how you think about food very
Hmm.
different.
Hmm.
When I first started writing, when I wrote about Thai restaurants, not, nobody, nobody had of my audience had been to Thailand. Today, if you're writing about Thai restaurants, you better know the difference between, you know, the food in Chiang Mai and the food in Bangkok because your audience will. They've been there. They've been to Japan. They've been to China. I mean, it's a very different um, it's a very different world we're living in, and tastes have changed in really profound ways through
Hmm.
travel.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Well, that's really interesting.
Hmm.
Another topic I wanted to talk about was when we talked about doing this issue on food poems to start with, it started occurring to us more and more how much how many parallels there are between food and writing, between cooking and writing specifically, and the process. I saw a quote you were talking. You said in the process of cooking to focus on the adventure of cooking, not the performance. And there's something about that that's just so central to doing anything creative, really. But cooking is a creative act, and writing is
Hmm.
a creative act. There's so many parallel things where you're experimenting and playing. There's that sense of play that is so key. Can you talk a little bit about that? About the way, do you feel the same sort of? I like to think about the creative state, the psychological state we get into. There's sort of meditation where we're sort of focused so much on what we're doing that like everything around us disappears, and there's that calming feeling of just intense concentration when you're writing or when you're cooking or when you're doing anything that has that kind of setup where it's a sort of a feedback and a creativity that's going on. So do you feel like in the same mental state when you're cooking as you do when you're writing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it takes everything, every pore of your being. You are very much in the moment when you're cooking. I mean, you have to be. You've got knives, you've got heat. It's dangerous, right? You cannot be thinking about something else while you're cooking. So you're very concentrated on it. But I mean, the other thing about being both a cook and a writer, and there's lots of writing about this, is that writing is such a long process, right? You sit down and, if you write very fast and you have a very fast publisher, maybe you can get a book out in 2 years into the world, which is very frustrating, right? It's so long. And cooking, you make a meal and you've produced something that people can enjoy, right now. And, for me, I need that because I tend not to let anybody read my stuff until I'm done. So it's like I'm not big on the workshop process and,
Hmm.
letting people read it. And so there's a long space between the writing and the consumption of it. Whereas with a meal, it's so satisfying. And it's also, it's so not frightening. I mean, as I said in my first cookbook, you know, it's just a meal. If it's not good, it's not tragic. But if you spent 2 years producing something and then it's not good, it's pretty tragic. You've just wasted 2 years of your life.
Yeah, that's so fascinating because when I talked to Ani DeFranco, she was saying that that's why she became a musician, not a writer, because it was the feedback of having an audience tell you right then versus having to wait for something to be published is the thing is she's too impatient, and so I think that's a really interesting perspective on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Jane Kramer wrote a wonderful piece in the New Yorker about cooking and writing, and do that they're the perfect two activities to go together.
Yeah. So you mentioned the editing process and not sharing with others until it's finished. So how do you go about revising then? We have one of the things we do is we have this Neil Postman Award for metaphor that we give out for the best use of metaphor. And it's interesting to talk to the winners every year because of how they approach, some of them have a sort of a way of spontaneously like being in the moment and sort of having that sense of Zen, like, oh, it just appears to me. And other people, add them later. And we talked to one winner who, goes through his poem specifically trying to find ways he can turn regular descriptions into metaphors because they're so powerful. Mm-hmm. As Postman said, they're instruments of perception. They're not just ornaments. And that's how we learn about the world in new ways is through metaphor. That's really the only way. And so I'm really curious about your editing process because you do have some great metaphors in your writing in addition to all the vivid detail. So when you did...
I have never gone through and tried to put metaphors into my work, ever. I can't even imagine going through and going, oh, I think I need a metaphor. I just read it. I just keep rereading it until it sounds right. I don't have another way to say that. And then, for me, and everybody has their own thing, but I mean, I find I have my agent who I really trust and my editor who I really trust. And I don't really want anybody else's feedback because, the thing I learned as an editor, at Gourmet, everybody would read the major pieces in the magazine and comment on them. And, we had these green sheets. And the thing I learned was everybody has a different idea. And editors who I really trusted and really liked would have taken out everything that I would put in. Everybody thought the lead was in a different place. And so if you start listening to a million people, it's just confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I definitely agree with that because I fall into the camp of writing, first thought, best thought, kind of, and get into the moment and push out your authentic voice that you're trying to do. I think that's maybe why your voice feels so authentic because you don't try to, ask for feedback and you aren't self-critical, but you just try to push where it wants to be on its own. I think there's an organic way of writing that it sounds like you appreciate.
Especially with your humor.
Also, I'm sorry?
Sorry, go ahead, Ruth.
What did you just say?
I was just saying, especially with your humor, it always feels so effortless and it really is, laugh out loud funny so much of the time. Like I was reading through your first reviews in the New York Times earlier, I'm just laughing hysterically, out loud because the way you approach it, it never feels forced or artificial somehow. And in poems, I love humor.
Somebody asked me after my first book came out, when did you know that you were funny? And I was like, I'm not funny. I don't think of myself as funny, but I think one of the things is, I'm totally untrained as a writer. I never, I don't have a background in writing or journalism. My undergraduate degree is in sociology and my master's is in history of art. I've never taken a writing class. The idea of taking a writing class scares me. I feel like I would probably lose my voice.
Another thing that in the parallels, Katie and I were talking about, she was trying to explain to me fine dining because it was something I just completely foreign to me. Growing up, in Western New York like I did, it was just like nothing.
Well, I didn't get into it till I was older
there you
either.
Go. So,
yeah.
but she was explaining, why the presentation matters so much, and that discussion, in the plating of food. And then we were talking, and we realized that plating a poem is so important too for the same reasons. Because when you confront it, your first impression clouds all further impressions, first of all. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the presentation, because that has an unexpected parallel, I think.
Well, now, when you talk about a poem, remember, I am the daughter of a book designer and who wrote a book on legibility. And, one of the things I open a book all the time, and my first thing I think is the type line is too long, which, if a badly designed book is very hard to read. And one of the things my father always said was, good design, you don't notice good design. And that's the point. You just think, boy, this book is easy to read. It keeps you turning the pages. He was very against flashy design. It was just about, he always said he was in the service of the writer, and he really didn't want anyone to notice that he had been there. That said, his most famous design was very flashy. He did the American edition of Ulysses, but and that was uncharacteristically flashy. But I feel like I approach the plate in the same way. It should look delicious. It should just, when someone sets something down in front of you, it doesn't matter what it is, but you should look at it and think, I just want to eat that, and, the Japanese notion of eating with your eyes is very important, but, styles change over time. So I've seen, things come in and out of, the Nouvelle Cuisine was very much about, giant plate, big frame around the food, tiny little bit of food, which, 10 years later just seemed ridiculous. And people started saying, oh yeah, the plate with one pea on it. But, then it was preceded by what my friend Marion Cunningham called mortuary food, which was kind of like, the cold salmon with the cucumber scales on it and the glistening aspect, and then there's that whole earlier thing of Jello molds, and so I actually, one of the lectures I give is called Watch What You Eat, and it's very much about how we look at food changes over time, and fascinatingly ends up having a lot to do with what is happening in society at that time and where the money is, and whether it's a rich society or not. I mean, the interesting thing about food is it is the first place that people display their wealth when they first come into money, is at the table. I mean, down the road, they'll build fancy houses. First, they'll buy fancy clothes and then fancy houses. But the first place you ever see it is on the plate. And, if you think about what's happening in restaurants, you start seeing that as well.
That's really interesting. And there's a way, too, that if I see a poem that's overly stylized and away from the norm, it feels to me like tweezer food, like it's just been plucked too carefully on the plate, and it really, you can feel the parallel of something that's overworked, I think, translates across different art types.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's like one of the things that's so nice about Save Me the Plums, where this is just to say, you look at it and it's refreshing just to look at visually.
Yeah, it's very much the case. It makes you hungry just looking at it, with it being a smaller size on there. And this is an amuse-bouche. I only have at most 2 bites, right, to get this in my mouth. I'm going to really savor this poem. Yeah. It's exciting. It's part of why I tend to like short poems more, too.
Yeah. Um, so the other thing that I want to talk about a little bit was, cooking is healing. And my kitchen year has so much to do with that, and so much. There's all talk all the time about how much poetry is like therapy, and how much and how much cooking, poetry is healing, and there's a way that cooking is healing too. And I think that's one of those parallels between the two because, in both creative acts where you're intensely focused, there's a lot of healing that it goes into that. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, I'm just thinking about, what do depressed teenagers, especially depressed teenage girls do? They write poetry, right? I mean, when I look at what I was doing at the age of 16, 17, 18, it's like, it was like the only time in my life I actually wrote what I thought of as poetry because it was the only way I knew how to get all these, horrible feelings
Mhm.
out into the world was by trying to write poetry. And um and then that is very much how I think of the kitchen. It is my healing place and it's where, and partly I think it is because it is the easiest way I know to use every part of yourself. I mean, every sense, all your mind, it's like it's a kind of meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And I go into the kitchen and it just always makes me feel better. And, which is why I ended up writing my kitchen year because it was such a terrible year. And the only way I could really get through that grief was by going into the kitchen, but also because it grounded me. It was like where I got back to what's important. And I think poetry does that too. It gets you back. It, it gets you away from all the nonsense of life. And there is so much of it. There is so
Mm.
much of striving and needing things. And um, in the kitchen, that all sort of goes away. And what you're doing is nurturing people. You're
Mm.
producing something that is going to make other people feel better. And in the process of making them feel better, you make yourself feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. And there are a lot of points
And
in
I
my
think poetry very much operates.
there are a lot of points in my kitchen year with how you chose to handle the recipes. I just love it because to me it is it poetry? Is it a recipe? Because the way you approached it was so different. It is like you are in the kitchen with someone and you're delicately sort of explaining how to go about it. And it doesn't have that, some of the problem. I don't have a ton of cookbooks, even though I love to cook, because so many of them can feel like someone's talking down from you on high. This is how much parsley you will add. It will only be half a teaspoon, but you and in this wonderful book go about it in such a way that it feels we get to heal along with you in that for whatever anyone is going through. And I think it really does stretch the boundaries of what's a poem, what's a recipe.
Well, I also got to put in, I mean, the only thing I've ever done that was consciously trying to write what I think of as poetry, which were the tweets that I did for a few years when Twitter first started. And I had this notion that I would every day try and make an experience, distill it down to what was that, 140 characters you used to be able to
Yeah.
have on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And to try and make people see and feel something in 140 characters, which, people always talked about, your haikus. And of course, they weren't haikus, but it was the same idea. It was like, how can you convey something in the most economical possible way?
Hmm.
Which is kind of how I think of what poetry is. I mean, how do you just get right into somebody else's head with as few words as possible? And,
Yeah.
so one of for me, the great joys of that book is, I mean, because those things vanish completely, but I got to put them into a book, just sort of sprinkle them through it.
Well, they definitely felt haiku-like to me. I'm gonna read one actually, if that's okay. So this is just at the beginning of the book. Mysterious, misty morning, crows wheeling, cawing. Storm is on the way. Coffee black, eggs fried, toast burnt, gourmet's over. Now what? It feels, I love that you were thinking about them as being haiku-like too, because I was, but I'm reading haiku all the time, so I thought maybe it's just me.
Yeah, no, I loved doing those. I really did. And then I just got to a point. I mean, people say like, "Why did you stop?" And it was like I was getting repetitive. There were only so many things I could say about a fried egg.
Well, it's interesting that haiku's coming up because it's one of the things I was thinking about reading your reviews is that we talked to haiku poets and they're sort of a different breed of poet because they try to write haiku really regularly, like they go daily on walks and think about things and come up with a haiku is sort of the traditional way to go about it. And how much it informs their life through the act of noticing and paying attention, like how much. And I think, what you're doing with food is help encourage people to notice and pay attention to what they're eating and what they're experiencing as they're eating or how they're cooking while they're cooking. And that sense of attention is what lets us, I think that's the healing component, I guess, is that we have that so much focused attention that we get to have gratitude for the experiences that we're having instead of worrying about what we did in the past or what's going to happen in the future that we're anxious about. It grounds us into the moment. And so I wonder if you could say something about that, about just the way that attention is so important within food writing, because I think that's such a key.
Well, it's not just food writing. I genuinely believe that the secret to life is paying attention to little things. And, everybody goes through life. It's like one of the reasons I love food is there is nothing better than a perfect peach, right? And the idea that experience is out there waiting for you. Every day there is some way to experience joy through food. And if nothing else good happens to you in a day, it would be tragic not to know when you bit into that peach or that piece of chocolate or whatever it was that you were not lucky to be alive, you know? And it doesn't have to be food. It can be a butterfly going by, or, I'm looking at a boat going down the Hudson here. But it is those moments in life that make life worth living. And so, for me, what my food writing is really about is pay attention to this. There are wonderful things happening around you all the time. And if you miss them, you're going to miss what life is really about.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a beautiful note to end on, Ruth, and the perfect at the hour mark. So thanks so much for giving us your time and getting to talk to you. It has been such a treat. Yeah. And
Thank you.
Reading your work too has just been really fun for the last few weeks. So thanks so much for doing all that you do and being here.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm thrilled to hear that you're writing a sequel to my Paris novel.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Thank
great.
you. This has been so much fun for me. So I'm very grateful to you. Thanks.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Ruth.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.